Hey friends, I've got a story that's so satisfying, it could be straight out of a movie. You know those moments in life when you feel like you've hit the jackpot of revenge? Well, this is one of those stories. Let me set the stage. My name is Martha. A few months back, my father passed away. It was a tough time for our family, but we pulled together to get through it. Dad had always been a great provider, and he left behind a sizable estate, including the family home, some investments, and a vintage car collection that would make any car enthusiast drool. Now, here's where things take a turn. My older brother, Mark, suddenly became a little too interested in Dad's assets. He'd always been the black sheep of the family, and I should have seen it coming. At the funeral, he couldn't stop talking about how he should get the lion's share because he had kids to support and bills to pay. Classic Mark. I knew something was up when he started getting chummy with Dad's lawyer, Mr. Stevens. They'd have hushed conversations at family gatherings, and it all seemed fishy. I couldn't prove anything, though, until the day of the will reading. The whole family gathered in the lawyer's office, and there was an air of tension you could cut with a knife. Mr. Stevens began to read the will, and as expected, Mark got the lion's share of the estate, including the family home. My heart sank as I thought he'd won. But then Mr. Stevens paused, looked over his glasses, and dropped the bombshell of the century. Dad's will stipulated that Mark would only get those assets if he agreed to one condition. He had to live in the family home for a year, without selling it or renting it out. If he failed to meet this condition, everything would be split equally among the rest of the family, me included. Mark's face turned a shade of crimson I didn't know existed. He spluttered, protested, and even tried to argue, but Mr. Stevens was firm. It was like something out of a legal drama. The rest of us couldn't believe our luck. So there you have it, friends. Mark's greed got the best of him, and now he's stuck in Dad's house, fuming while the rest of us get our fair share. I'm not one to revel in another's misfortune, but this time, karma delivered a dish that was too delicious to resist. Listen to my story to the end, and I'll spill the beans on how Mark's year in the family home is going. It's going to be a wild ride, and I can't wait to share it with you all. I couldn't help but smile as Mr. Stevens calmly closed the will, effectively sealing Mark's fate. It was poetic justice at its finest, and I savored the moment. Mark, on the other hand, was livid. His face turned an alarming shade of red, and he shot daggers at Mr. Stevens. "You can't be serious," Mark shouted, his voice a mixture of anger and disbelief. "This is insane, and it's not what Dad would have wanted." Mr. Stevens, ever the composed lawyer, simply shrugged. "I'm just here to execute your father's wishes, Mark. He outlined this condition in his will, and we must respect it." My other siblings and I exchanged glances, trying to contain our excitement. We had always known Mark's true colors, but this was a whole new level of karma coming back to bite him. As the will reading continued, Mr. Stevens outlined the logistics of the condition. Mark had 30 days to move into the family home, and he couldn't sell it or rent it out for a year from the date of occupancy. If he violated these terms, the assets would be divided among the remaining siblings. Mark stormed out of the lawyer's office, vowing to fight this injustice in court. He even threatened to contest the will's validity. But deep down, we knew he was cornered. Dad had been meticulous in his planning, and Mr. Stevens assured us that the will was ironclad. Over the next few weeks, Mark reluctantly moved into the family home, bitterness oozing from every pore. We all helped with the transition, making sure he had no excuses to break the conditions. It was amusing to see him try to negotiate with us for leniency, but we held firm. This was Dad's final wish, and we intended to honor it. Mark's life in the family home was far from comfortable. He resented every moment spent there, surrounded by memories of our childhood and the life he so desperately wanted to escape. I couldn't help but relish in the sweet taste of revenge as I watched him grumble and complain. But there was one thing Mark didn't anticipate: the watchful eyes of the neighborhood. Our parents had lived in that house for decades, and the neighbors were like an extended family. They knew about Dad's will and the conditions he had set for Mark. It didn't take long for them to become Mark's unofficial surveillance team. Every time he tried to bring in a realtor or put the house on the market, someone would anonymously tip us off. Mark's frustration grew with each failed attempt. It was as if the universe was conspiring against him. As the days turned into weeks, Mark's resolve began to waver. He realized that he was trapped in a situation of his own making, and no amount of tantrums or threats could change that. The house, once a symbol of his potential windfall, had become a gilded cage. Next, I will tell you into the comical mishaps and neighborhood interventions that made Mark's year in the family home even more entertaining. Stay tuned, friends. Justice is being served one day at a time. As the weeks turned into months, Mark's predicament in the family home only grew more comical and bizarre, like a real-life sitcom unfolding before our eyes. It was a twisted form of poetic justice that I couldn't help but relish, given what he had put our family through. After all, he had unscrupulously seized our rightful inheritance, and now he was paying the price, quite literally, for his avarice and deceit. One of the most entertaining aspects of this entire ordeal was witnessing Mark's desperate attempts to maintain some semblance of his old life within the confines of the family home. You see, he had been a big shot in his upscale condo, living a life of opulence with a personal chef, a housekeeper, and a gardener to cater to his every whim. However, in the family home, he had to fend for himself, and the results were nothing short of comedic brilliance. I still vividly remember the time he tried to cook a meal for himself. It was an epic disaster of monumental proportions, a culinary catastrophe that would be legendary in family lore. Smoke billowed from the kitchen, and the shrill blaring of the fire alarm reverberated through the house as he desperately tried to salvage his burnt creation. We, the rightful heirs who had suffered his greed, rushed over, fearing for the safety of the house. Instead, we found Mark, frantically waving a dish towel in front of the alarm, his face smudged with soot, and his once impeccable chef's apron now a grimy, scorched rag. "You guys never had to deal with this," he yelled, pointing accusatory fingers at us, as if we were to blame for his culinary calamity. "I can't believe Dad's doing this to me." We couldn't help but chuckle at his culinary misadventure. It was a stark reminder that Mark was completely out of his element in the family home. His lavish lifestyle, which he had flaunted so shamelessly, had left him ill-prepared for the simple realities of everyday living that the rest of us had long since mastered. But the most satisfying moments of all were when the neighborhood, our silent allies, came to our aid. They had taken it upon themselves to enforce Dad's unorthodox conditions, ensuring that Mark didn't dare to try and circumvent them. If he so much as contemplated putting the house on the market, the local real estate agents would be discreetly informed about the will's ironclad stipulations. Once, Mark attempted to rent out a room in the house, perhaps thinking it would bring in some much-needed income. However, little did he know that one of the vigilant neighbors had assumed the role of a potential tenant, engaging in a charade that almost felt like an episode of a hidden camera prank show. At the very last moment, just as Mark was ready to seal the deal, the neighbor revealed the truth, leaving Mark flustered and fuming. His frustration knew no bounds, and we reveled in his exasperation. As the months dragged on, Mark's relationship with the neighborhood soured further. He had unwittingly become the pariah of the community, and people avoided him like the plague. His desperate attempts to garner sympathy from the very people he had once ignored or treated with disdain were met with icy indifference. It was poetic justice at its finest, a symphony of retribution conducted by the universe itself. Mark had grievously underestimated the power of unity within a close-knit neighborhood, and it had become his undoing. The collective strength of the community was a force to be reckoned with, and Mark was discovering this firsthand. But there was still one final twist in this tale of revenge, a revelation that left us all dumbfounded. Next, I will tell you how Mark's tumultuous year in the family home took an unexpected turn, shaking the very foundations of our family's legacy. Stay with me, friends, because this story is about to get even juicier. As the seasons changed and a year passed since Dad's funeral, the drama surrounding Mark's residency in the family home took an unexpected turn. It was as if fate had decided to add one final twist to this bizarre tale of revenge, and it left us all in a state of bewilderment. You see, despite the absurd conditions laid out in Dad's will, Mark had managed to hold on to the family home for an entire year. He had endured the comedic mishaps, the neighborhood's vigilant surveillance, and the utter isolation he had brought upon himself. But he was unyielding in his determination to cling to the house, convinced that he would outlast the stipulations of the will. However, Mark had overlooked a crucial detail, one that would prove to be his downfall. The family home was an aging structure, and its maintenance required not only financial resources, but also a deep understanding of its quirks and idiosyncrasies. Mark possessed neither. At first, we noticed minor issues: a leaky roof, a malfunctioning furnace, and creaking floorboards. Mark, in his arrogance, believed he could simply hire contractors to address these problems. But what he failed to realize was that the house had a peculiar temperament, and it seemed to rebel against his presence. The leaky roof became an incessant drip, defying all attempts at repair. The furnace emitted eerie, discordant noises that kept Mark awake at night, and the creaking floorboards seemed to whisper haunting secrets. It was as if the house itself had joined the neighborhood in its silent revolt against its unwelcome occupant. Mark's frustration grew day by day. He hired a slew of contractors, each more bewildered than the last by the house's bizarre behavior. Plumbers scratched their heads as pipes seemed to change course at will. Electricians were confounded by switches that operated in reverse, and carpenters found themselves entangled in a maze of hidden passages behind walls. His financial resources began to dwindle as he poured money into futile attempts to tame the rebellious house. The neighborhood, well aware of his predicament, watched with a mixture of amusement and satisfaction. It was as if the house itself had become an active participant in our quest for revenge. Mark's sleepless nights and growing desperation were a source of dark amusement for us. He would often emerge from the house in disheveled attire, hair askew, and eyes bloodshot from lack of rest. His once confident demeanor had crumbled, replaced by a haunted look that mirrored the house's own peculiar personality. But it was during a stormy night that the house unleashed its most spectacular display of defiance. As thunder rumbled and rain lashed against the windows, Mark was jolted awake by a cacophony of crashing and banging. He stumbled through the darkened corridors, his flashlight barely penetrating the gloom. What he discovered was a scene straight out of a horror movie. Furniture levitated, seemingly of its own volition, and household objects danced through the air. The walls vibrated with an otherworldly energy, and the very foundation of the house trembled. It was as if the house had awakened its dormant spirits to expel the intruder. Mark fled the house in terror, leaving behind his belongings and his illusions of conquest. As he stood in the pouring rain, drenched and defeated, the neighborhood watched in eerie silence. The house had made its final verdict, and Mark had been judged unworthy. In the aftermath of this supernatural spectacle, Mark decided he had had enough. He relinquished his claim to the family home, realizing that some forces were beyond human comprehension. The house, it seemed, had exacted its revenge in the most enigmatic and poetic manner. And so, friends, our family home returned to us, no longer tainted by Mark's presence. The neighborhood, our steadfast allies, rejoiced in silence, knowing that justice had been served. Mark, once a symbol of greed and betrayal, faded into obscurity. But the tale doesn't end here. Next, I'll share the ultimate twist in this saga, an unexpected discovery that shed light on Dad's true intentions and left us with a newfound appreciation for the eccentricities of our family home. Stay tuned for the grand finale. As the dust settled on Mark's hasty departure from our family home, we thought the tale had reached its conclusion. The house, having successfully defended itself against the invader, returned to its serene, if slightly quirky, state. The neighborhood, once rife with intrigue and espionage, resumed its usual rhythms, and life appeared to return to normal. But as fate would have it, the final act of this peculiar drama was still waiting in the wings. It was a revelation that would not only astonish us, but also provide closure to the enigmatic legacy our father had left behind. In the days following Mark's departure, I began the arduous task of sorting through the accumulated detritus he had left behind. It was a Herculean effort, as he had seemingly abandoned most of his possessions in his panicked flight from the house. Among the discarded items, I stumbled upon an old leather-bound journal, weathered by time and neglect. Curiosity piqued, I opened the journal to find the handwritten entries of our father, dating back several decades. It was a chronicle of his thoughts, dreams, and aspirations, a glimpse into the mind of a man who had always been somewhat of an enigma to us. As I read through the pages, a pattern began to emerge. Our father's writing spoke of his love for the family home, his fascination with its idiosyncrasies, and his deep connection to the neighborhood. It was clear that the house held a special place in his heart, and he had dedicated years to understanding its mysteries. But the most astonishing revelation came when I reached the final entries of the journal. In those pages, our father had detailed a plan that would ultimately lead to Mark's downfall and the house's triumphant defense. He had orchestrated the entire series of events, from the eccentric will to the house's rebellious antics. It was all part of his grand scheme to ensure that the family home remained untouched by those who did not truly appreciate its quirks. In his own words, he had written, "Only those who understand the heart of this house deserve to inherit it. I will test them as the house has tested me." It was a revelation that left me both astounded and moved. Our father had devised this elaborate ruse, not out of malice, but out of love for the house he had called home for so many years. He had used his eccentricity and flair for the dramatic to protect the place he held dear. And so, friends, the story comes to a close with a newfound appreciation for our father's legacy. The house, once a symbol of revenge, now stood as a testament to his love and ingenuity. Mark's brief tenure had inadvertently become a test of character, and he had failed spectacularly. As for us, we continued to live in the house, embracing its quirks and mysteries with open hearts. It was a daily reminder of our father's eccentricity and his deep affection for the place he had called home. The neighborhood, once divided by suspicion, had come together in a shared understanding of the house's unique magic. In the end, it was a tale of revenge turned redemption, of a house that defended itself, and of a father's enduring love. And as I write these final words, I can't help but smile, knowing that our family home will continue to enchant and confound generations to come. Thank you for joining me on this extraordinary journey, friends. And remember, sometimes the most unusual stories hold the deepest truths.